Welcome back to session 2 of our overview of paper 1 and paper 2 of the SACAP PPE exam. I'm going to be talking to you about the overview of contracts today. So the last time we spoke about an overview, just a general overview of what paper 1 is about and one of the sections in paper 1. Today I'm going to be talking about paper 2 and a general overview of the idea of contracts. So here we go. If I have a look at contracts and contracts specifically related to the construction industries, I'm looking at contracts for the client, for the architect, for the contractor, for the professionals. Now, if you can recall from the last session, we said a contract is any agreement with a serious intention. And so now we're talking about those contracts. We're talking about those contracts in the context of the construction professionals or the AEC industry. So we're talking about people like engineers and architects and property developers and property developers. The quantity surveyors. We're talking about people overall managing this process. They're not property developers, project managers, sorry. And so all of these guys that I just mentioned to you are the same people that were stipulated or that were mentioned inside the CBE, the Council for the Built Environment. Remember that act? I mentioned now all of those professionals. Now, all of those professionals belong to the construction industry. And so what needs to happen now is before we conduct any work with the public, there needs to be a contract or a serious intention between the two of us to make sure nobody messes up. Or if someone does mess up, we can hold somebody else responsible. And so that our terms and conditions are very clear, the scope of the work is well defined, and that there is an obligation between the two of us. Now, let's have a look. We're going to talk about construction. We want to see how the construction industry then is going to ask us to do a specific contract for them. Client-architect agreement is one of the initial starting phases. And then we move on to construction and we'll talk about JBCC. So the new concepts I want you particularly to take into account here. One of those new concepts is offer and acceptance. Now, when you go into a shop, and I always use this particular example, the price that's displayed there is only an offer according to the law. It doesn't mean you have to pay that price. It's only an offer that you have to make. You can accept that offer, accept it, and you can be, oh, cool, I want to pay. So when you go to the till and you're paying that, you can accept it. You are now officially accepting it by paying for that at the till. But you know that technically you could argue that price lower, and that's how negotiations work. But you kind of feel embarrassed to do this in a supermarket, maybe because so many people are around or because nobody else is doing it. But you could technically do that because according to the law, they only made an offer. When you see an advertisement, it's an offer. Doesn't mean that has to be the way it is. It's not set in stone. So offer and acceptance is what contracts are based on. Now, moving on to the second idea, as I mentioned, offer and acceptance now kind of gives way for a contract to happen. There are a couple things that ensure that a contract is valid, and those things, those 5 points, if you have a look up on them, some of those points are things like everyone in the party must agree to it. There must be mutual consent. Everybody must be of sound mind, and it must be legal. So there's quite a few requirements that make up a contract, and you can read that up. That information is quite easily available if you have to search it. But the contract, once it's entered into, there's a thing called delict as well. Now, delict and the idea of contract and delict goes together. The best way I can maybe allow you to remember this is to think of every time you see the word delict as the word default. It's almost saying over and above what you are expected to do, it is your delictual duty. By default, it's your duty. This is what has to be done. And we're going to get into this concept a little bit later on. But delict, just remember the word by default. It's something like this. I'm the architect, and whether I get paid or not, it is my delictual duty to ensure that the building is done to the best of my ability. By default, it's my duty, whether I'm getting paid to do it or not, because I have the interest of the public at heart. Now moving over from that, so we have offer acceptance, which gives way to a contract, and sometimes in a contract, you have a delictual duty to do something, even if you aren't paid to do it. This now brings about the idea that a contract can give you a sense of agency. Agency is like you being an agent. It's you taking on a role which gives you to do the power, or which gives you the power to do other things you might not necessarily have been able to do before. Agency is like acting on behalf of somebody else. You are not that person, but they are giving you the agency, the will, the ability to perform on behalf of them. Sometimes though, in a contract and when you have agency, somebody messes up. And it happens even when you're in a relationship. And I mention it this way because it's probably one of the easiest ways to remember. When you forget Bay's birthday, or you forget Bay's anniversary or your anniversary, Or something happens and you mess up in your relationship. You breach that contract. You're like, babe, you're supposed to have loved me through thick and thin, and you didn't do that. And so what you do is you're like, okay, don't worry, I'm going to do something. I'm going to get you some flowers and some chocolates, and I'm going to treat you to a date night or whatever you do. You breached the contract, the relationship you had, almost like this covert contract, if you want to call it that, and you remedied it. Hey, remedy, like from the word remedial, almost looking like it comes from the word medicine. You can see the med there, medicine. It's like you are trying to give medication to fix the problem, okay? Try to heal it. So when there's a breach, there must be a remedy, trying to fix it up. So whenever you have a contract, if there's a breach, the contract must state, if this happens, then this is how you fix it. And only once this can't be resolved will we go to other forms of resolving the problem. We'll talk about arbitration and litigation and all those things at other times. The one you don't ever want to go to is litigation, like going to court. No one wants that. If you have to think about it, nobody wants to litter. And the word litter sounds like litigation. So in your head, make that association. I don't ever want to litter. I don't ever want to go to litigation. That's too costly. So these are the new concepts I want you to understand. You probably wouldn't have seen these concepts before, especially if you didn't do professional practice or some sort of professional practice module at university. Hold on to these thoughts. Construction. So now we're talking about construction, and in construction, we mentioned that we are here in the construction industry. Here, I'm not talking about the act of construction. I'm talking about the construction industry. That's what this particular heading is talking about. In the construction industry, we have professionals. Those professionals have jobs to do. An architect is designing the overall project and is giving vision and guidance and all of those things, making your dreams reality and all the stuff we sell and we say. You have the engineer ensuring that it's structurally sound and the myriad of other things they do. The quantity surveying ensuring the costing don't go out of budget. It's in time within budget. We are all professionals with a duty that we are trained, skilled to do. But remember, once we have almost entered into, once we have entered into a contract, an agreement, our roles as professionals can be rebranded. So it's almost as though you as a professional, when you enter into a contract, you are going into a play. You are being ascribed new roles. And one of those roles, perhaps the lead role in this play, is the one of the principal agent. Now, the principal agent is somebody who's going to manage that entire process, I'll get back to the word now, manage that entire process on behalf of the client. Now, manage is not actually the correct word to use. I'm using it just to try and give you some sort of idea. The correct term to use is administer. The principal agent administers the contract, okay? Ensuring that everything works administratively correctly in terms of this contract. And so the principal agent is given powers. Okay? They say the phrase for that is a quasi-judicial, if I'm not mistaken. So it's almost like you have some sort of powers of the state almost, or you have powers, you are acting on behalf of somebody, you have agency, you can act on behalf of somebody. So I'm running through this one again. There's a construction industry, we have professionals. But once you enter into a contract, it's like you're given a new role. That role now you'll be designated into an agent, principal agent, a contractor, employer. You're going to be given new roles. And in those roles, you have agency, the power to do certain things. And so if you look on the next slide, we're talking about SACAP stages, and I'm mentioning on the slide that we're looking at here on the left-hand side, we're saying here are the stages of SACAP. If you have understanding and context, you know there's 6 stages of SACAP, SACAP stages, and each one of the stages kind of defines the scope at which the architect is liable and the scope of work is to be done and the amount of money based on the budget that is to be paid to the architect or the architectural designer at this stage. So here, once you now have these this idea that you are acting on behalf of somebody, you are a principal agent, I'm not taking you into the first step. So here's you, a professional. And you are now a professional that is wanting to undertake a task. You need to go to the client and you need to say, we need to enter into an agreement so that I can do this task for you with all of the restrictions and limitations and all of the scope and the budget and all of that laid out so that there's an agreement between yourself and myself. And if I mess up, you hold me liable. And if you mess up, I hold you liable. We now have a duty towards each other. There's a couple of ways to do this where you are starting off this relationship with the client. One of those ways is by entering into the client-architect agreement, the PROXA agreement. Now, there's a few bodies like SIRE and a few others that have agreed that this is a client this is the contract rather we're all going to use, the client architect agreement. They call it CAA, client architect agreement. PROXA. There's also another called the SLA, service level agreement. Now, most firms have this, the service level agreement, which states what the architect's duty is towards the client up until a certain stage. So what is that stage? Around about 4.2. It could be less or it could end at 4.2. If you look at the CAA or the PROXA agreement, you see that it mentions all the way to stage 6. What usually happens is that the architect, for the design part of the project, the part where they're designing and submitting to council, they will use PROXA agreement. Moving on from the PROXA agreement, you'll get into the JBCC contract, which is a new contract which you use. That is used for construction. And I want you to make that distinction in your mind. Try to use the CAA or the PROXA agreement for the design and submission to council, and the JBCC contract for when you're actually undergoing construction, when construction is actually happening. So let's look at this particular one. We're looking here at stages 1, 2, 3, 4. 4.1, 4.2, and the stages, as you know, is inception, concept viability, then we're going to be looking at design development, then it's documentation, and then procurement. Just so you know, I'm mentioning to you, so hopefully you remember it subconsciously. So the client architect agreement, CAA, PROXA agreement, also talks about this idea of principal agent. But then it talks about the contractor and subcontractors. Now, a contractor is someone that's going to be constructing it for you, but they can have subcontractors, so people working under them. What I want you to understand is that subcontractors can be designated into 4 different categories: direct, domestic, nominated, and selected. And the reason why we are defining these and the reason why we are labeling each of these is because we are trying to make sure that whoever is the one that appointed them, whether it's the contractor or the client, that is the person that's going to be responsible for whether they mess up or continue in a progressive direction towards finishing the work. They are responsible should anything go wrong. And those are the 4 types. Now, the direct, domestic, nominated, and selected apply to the subcontractors, and it is the duty now of the contractor, depending on which one of them he has selected, it is the duty of him to ensure that he manages their process going well. Remember, the contractor is the only one that manages the construction process, not the principal agent. The principal agent only administers. So the relationship exists between the client and the contractor, not the principal agent. The principal agent is representing the client, but the principal agent is not managing the process. The contractor manages the process. And this relationship is quite critical to understand. Don't mess that up. Don't think that the client has a relationship with you. They don't have a relationship with you. You are acting on behalf of them. The relationship is between the contractor and the client. Fundamental principle to understand, to take note of. Remember that. Finally, in the end, we have the client. The client can be referred to as the client or the employer because they are employing everybody who's in this project. Now we move on to the final part, and we're going to talk about JBCC. So you can see that the list on the side has moved up. We moved away from stage 1 to 4.2. Now moving on to stage 5 and 6. Stage 5 and 6 talks about construction. Now in the construction phases, in South Africa, we have the JBCC agreement. Now, the JBCC agreement is a South African contract system. It is the joint building contracts that we are using. It is created locally for South Africans. There are others like FIDIC and NEC and GCC, the Swedish ones, European ones, the French ones. They are different ones, but they are not relevant to here. Now, some people might argue, well, NEC is more progressive, JBCC isn't, and all of these things. But whatever your firm is using, whatever we are all using in our firms, it's not really, it's not going to be tested specifically on the one that you are using. What is going to come out in the SACAP exam, particularly paper 2, we're going to be looking at the JBCC contracts. So the JBCC contract is what we're going to be paying attention to. And that's why we're looking at this. And we're not going to detail with the other contracts. Now, the JBCC contracts can be broken up into 2 major categories of understanding. There's further things it can be broken up into. I just want you to remember it this way. The minor works agreement, which is one of them, talks about the duration of the project and the type of project. So if your project, say, for example, is only 3 months long, then it would typically fit under the minor works agreement. This is the contract that you're going to use. It's a JBCC contract, but it's a type of JBCC contract or a subcategory under it called minor works agreement, MWA. And it's used specifically when the projects are short and for the type of complexity of project. But then you have the PBA, the principal building agreement. This is the one that everyone generally uses. And inside the PBA, we have clauses and paragraphs. And the best analogy I can give you when you are doing paper 2 in the PPE exam is that you need to be able to reference, like how you would have done academic referencing when you were on campus. You need to reference the clauses and the paragraphs whenever there's a scenario that comes up. So there's a scenario that comes up, and in the exam they say, this is such and such a thing that happened. You usually say, this is how you will respond to it in terms of the JBCC. And then you must quote, you must reference the JBCC. Say, according to paragraph this, clause that, clause 12, for example, this is what such and such must happen. Now, this is the two major ones we're going to be looking at: minor works agreement and the principal building agreement. In here is where you get most of the questions coming out for paper 2. And so what I want you to take into account, particularly in this stage, is that JBCC, we're looking at the construction phase, 5 and 6. And here we're going to be talking about the project type and whatever happens in this project, how do we respond to it? What if such a contractor makes a fault or a flaw? How do we repair it? How do we remedy it? And this is where the idea of breaches and remedies come in. When there's a breach, how do we remedy it? The JBCC tells you all of these things. And so the next time that we meet again, we'll discuss a little bit more in detail about some of these ideas, like, for example, what is the direct and domestic and nominated and selected. And then we'll also talk about these breaches and remedies, but we'll talk about it when it comes to the paper. And we'll have a look at some of the examples on the paper and see how they actually come out in the examination. How can you answer that? And then we move again into another realm. We'll talk a little bit more about the Companies Act, and we'll talk about you starting your own firm and how do you manage the processes around this. So I hope